But so the town turns automatic to Warpool. Send the sign or in I crane.
In August 1953, the CIA paid street gangs in Tehran to attack random civilians, not to kill anyone specific, just to attack people. The goal was to make the city look chaotic enough that Iranians would think their own government had lost control. And it worked. 300 people died. A democratically elected prime minister was removed from power. And the operation had a name, Operation Ajax. Let's look at what they actually put in writing. The CIA director's brother, John Foster Dulles, Secretary of State, had just finished negotiating a law firm deal that exempted an American fruit company from taxes in Guatemala. 1 year later, that same Dulles administration authorized another coup in Guatemala, using nearly identical tactics: fake radio broadcasts, paid agitators, manufactured chaos. The script was identical. The only difference was the geography. So here's the question nobody wants to ask. How many times did this actually work before anyone called it what it was? The Iran coup happened in 1953. It's declassified now. The CIA didn't formally admit its role until 2013, 60 years later. But the mechanics were never secret to the people running it. President Eisenhower approved Operation Ajax in June 1953. Allen Dulles, the CIA director, oversaw the planning. His brother John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State, was already deep in Latin American affairs. These weren't rogue operatives. This was policy. The British had started pushing the U.S. to remove Mohammad Mossadegh after he nationalized Iran's oil in 1951, cutting the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company out of the deal. London was desperate. They'd already tried to strangle Iran's economy by blockading oil exports. Didn't work. So they pivoted. They convinced Washington that Mossadegh was secretly a communist. Truman said no. Eisenhower said yes. The story changed when the man in the White House changed. That's how fast the ideology rewired itself to match the geopolitical calculation. By June 1953, Eisenhower had authorized the operation. By August, it was over. Mossadegh was gone. Imprisoned, then house arrest for life. One of his advisors was executed. A dozen military officers and student leaders were killed. The Shah, the guy who'd been too terrified to sign the coup orders in the first place, suddenly had enough spine to become an autocrat. Systems don't panic. They adjust. 1 year later, in Guatemala. Same problem, different country. A president named Jacobo Arbenz had promised land reform, returning agricultural land from American companies back to Guatemalans. The United Fruit Company owned massive plantations there. Their president, Sam Zamuri, hired Edward Bernays to manage the public relations. Bernays was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, the inventor of modern propaganda, the guy who wrote the book literally called Propaganda. He understood that truth wasn't a constraint. It was a resource to be manufactured. Bernays set up front groups. The Middle America Information Bureau, the Middle American Research Institute at Tulane University. He got journalists to visit Guatemala on curated tours. He planted articles in The Nation magazine, a liberal magazine, making the case that Arbenz was a communist threat. Eisenhower, the same Eisenhower, authorized Operation PBSuccess in August 1953. Same month as Iran, the CIA flooded Guatemala with fake radio broadcasts. One broadcast literally said, "It is not true that the waters of Lake Atitlan have been poisoned." Think about that for a second. They had to deny poisoning a lake. The only way you need to deny that is if people already believe it. Arbenz resigned on June 27, 1954. A military strongman named Carlos Castillo Armas took over with U.S. support. He set up concentration camps, executed suspected communists. Guatemala spent the next 40 years in authoritarian hell. And Bernays, in his memoir, he complained that United Fruit fired him and told him he was too rich to need the work. He positioned himself as the victim of the revolution he engineered. The math balances, but the logic doesn't. Here's what matters right now. In 2013, the CIA finally declassified its role in Iran. In 2024, we're still living with the consequences. The 1979 Islamic Revolution that deposed the Shah. Historians trace it directly to the 1953 coup. 26 years of waiting. 26 years of the Shah consolidating autocratic power, jailing dissidents, building a secret police apparatus that made him so unpopular that when the revolution came, it came fast. And we're watching the same pattern repeat across the globe. The techniques Bernays pioneered in the 1950s, the AstroTurf campaigns, the front groups, the curated media narratives, are now the infrastructure of modern disinformation. The sources we have now, declassified government records, Bernays' own memoir, academic analysis of contemporary information warfare, they're showing us that what happened in Iran and Guatemala wasn't aberration. It was template. The Council on Foreign Relations ranked the Iran coup as the fourth worst U.S. foreign policy decision. Not worst. Fourth, which means there's a ranked list. Which means this happened over and over. Which means we need to understand the mechanism before the next administration decides to use it. Because they will. They always do. Let's look at what they actually put in writing. The Council on Foreign Relations document on the Iran coup states, the United States took the leading role in a covert operation called Operation Ajax, whereby CIA-funded agents were used to foment unrest inside Iran by way of the harassment of religious and political leaders and a media disinformation campaign. Foment unrest, harassment, those are the words they chose. Not destabilization, not overthrow. Foment like you're starting a fire. Then it specifies, these efforts, formally approved by President Dwight D. Eisenhower, formally approved, which means it went through channels. There was paperwork. Eisenhower didn't wake up one morning and decide to coup Iran. He signed something. Someone handed him a briefing. He initialed it. The system worked exactly as designed. The same CFR source describes how they actually executed it. Allen Dulles, the director of the CIA, and John Foster Dulles' younger brother, oversaw the planning for Operation Ajax, a covert campaign to inflame Iranian anger at Mossadegh by paying journalists, mullahs, and politicians to attack him as corrupt and power-hungry. Paying journalists. That's not spin, that's not PR, that's direct payment for false accusations. And then, at the same time, street gangs would be paid to attack public figures, increasing instability and fueling suspicions that Mossadegh was attacking his critics. So the CIA paid street gangs to attack people so that Iranians would think Mossadegh ordered the attacks. That's not an operation, that's a frame-up. And it killed 300 people. The document doesn't shy from it. Fighting between supporters of both sides resulted in hundreds of deaths. Hundreds, in a capital city. From a campaign of deliberate chaos that the CIA designed and funded. Now shift to Guatemala. The source on Edward Bernays and the Guatemalan coup explains Bernays' strategy this way. Bernays surmised he could use this land-back promise to convince Americans that Arbenz was a threat not only to United Fruit, but to the United States as well. If Bernays could brand Arbenz a communist, he could inflate the threat posed in Guatemala. Brand him, not prove him, brand him. And here's where it gets specific. Bernays wrote an article, or had someone write it under a pseudonym for The Nation magazine. The article was credited to Ellis Ogle, a name that had appeared exactly once before in The Nation in 1920 in a letter to the editor about labor coverage. 60 years earlier, the document notes that Ellis Ogle appeared in a 1920 letter to the editor chastising the Boston Evening Transcript for its labor coverage. One final wrinkle. The CIA first authorized William Godet to begin receiving payments for special reports in 1950. The same FBI case file that contained the earlier 1968 United Fruit Memorandum also observed that he may do some freelance writing under a pen name. May do. Under a pen name. The documentation is deliberately vague. Because if they named the pen name, the whole operation becomes visible, so they buried it in a footnote. Here's where the two operations start to merge. The Iran source says, Kermit Roosevelt, a grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt, ran Operation Ajax on the ground in Iran. A specific person, a name, a bloodline even. Then it describes Roosevelt's problem. The plan hinged on the Shah firing Mossadegh, but the Shah balked. The Shah was terrified. So Roosevelt had to manufacture consent. Whether because Roosevelt paid protesters or because ordinary Iranians became alarmed that Mossadegh was seeking to end the monarchy, public sentiment and military support turned against the prime minister. That weather is doing heavy lifting. Either the CIA paid people to protest, or Iranians spontaneously decided to oppose their own prime minister. The source can't decide which, so it leaves both options open. That's not history. That's plausible deniability baked into the scholarship. But compare that to what Bernays did in Guatemala. The Guatemala source states, Bernays, having removed his final obstacle to a coup, began organizing trips to Guatemala for reporters. Beginning with New York Times writers Will Lisner and Creed Calhoun, Bernays instigated a press panic, with carefully curated tours highlighting the dangers of the Arbenz government. These Bernays-sponsored trips coincided with violent protests, helping to shape perception of Arbenz as a power-hungry dictator. Curated tours, coinciding with violent protests. It's the same playbook. Create the appearance of grassroots opposition by manufacturing chaos and controlling the narrative about what the chaos means. The Bernays source includes his own autobiography, Biography of an Idea. He writes, I proposed sending the Nation article to 100,000 liberals. I believe the Caribbean ferment was bound to become increasingly important. Liberals must play a decisive role. Zemmour agreed. Send the article to 100,000 liberals. To convince them, to move them, to get them to support a coup. And it worked. Zemmour started funding the Nation directly. The source notes, Zemmour appeared happy with its influence and started providing direct financial support to the Nation the following year. So the sequence is, Bernays plants an article, gets liberals to read it, liberals start supporting the coup. A corporate executive funds the magazine. That's not influence. That's capture. And Bernays' goal was explicit. From his biography, his goal, as described in Biography of an Idea, was to help the public learn more about the countries in which United Fruit functioned and what social, economic, or other purposes it fulfilled. Learn more. As if United Fruit was a charitable institution. As if the public needed to understand United Fruit's benevolence. He was selling corporate imperialism as public education. Now here's the thing. The sources we have on modern disinformation warfare, the LS piece on Russia's information operations, it describes the current moment this way. Foreign state-sponsored disinformation campaigns, especially those orchestrated by Russia, have emerged as potent, low-cost tools for geopolitical influence and social disruption. Potent, low-cost tools, same language used to describe what the CIA did in Iran. The LS source continues, Russia's deployment of disinformation has been especially systematic and adaptive, integrating propaganda techniques rooted in Soviet-era doctrine with modern digital tools. But here's what it doesn't say. It doesn't acknowledge that the United States pioneered this exact playbook in the 1950s. The CIA and Bernays developed the template. The Soviets learned it. Now we act shocked when Russia uses the same methods against us. The LS source criticizes Russian campaigns for exploiting socio-political fault lines of target countries, race, immigration, economic inequality. Exactly what Operation Ajax did in Iran. Exploit religious tensions, exploit class resentment, manufacture division. But the U.S. campaigns are studied as history. The Russian campaigns are studied as threats. Systems don't panic, they adjust. They just apply their own tactics to new adversaries and call it defense. Here's the thesis. The United States didn't stumble into coups and disinformation campaigns in Iran and Guatemala. It invented the playbook, perfected it, and then acted shocked when other nations used the same tactics against us. More specifically, the mechanisms of modern information warfare, the astroturfing, the fake grassroots movements, the coordinated media narratives, the algorithmic targeting of socio-political divisions, these aren't new tools that Russia or China innovated. They're exports from the American 1950s. Edward Bernays and Allen Dulles didn't just topple governments. They established the institutional architecture for doing it invisibly. They created the language that allows a president to authorize an operation and call it something that sounds bureaucratic. Operation Ajax, Operation PBSuccess, not overthrow, but covert campaign, not kill, but foment unrest. The vocabulary was designed to survive documentation, and it did. 60 years of declassified files show us exactly how they did it, and we still use the same euphemisms when we talk about what happened. The thesis is this. America trained the world in information warfare, then spent the last 70 years complaining that the world had learned too well. The strongest objection to this thesis is straightforward. Context matters. In 1953, the Soviet Union was consolidating power in Eastern Europe. Mao had just taken China. Korea was still hot. The U.S. believed, or claimed to believe, that the world was at risk of falling to communism. Mossadegh was weak. He was losing control. Maybe he was going to align with the communists. Maybe the operation prevented a Soviet takeover. Maybe it saved Iran from becoming another Soviet satellite state. That's the counter-argument. That's what Eisenhower heard from John Foster Dulles, and it convinced him to flip from skepticism to authorization. The documents show Eisenhower saying in March 1953 that Mossadegh was the only hope for the West and Iran. Then 3 months later, he approves the coup. What changed? Not the facts on the ground. The facts stayed the same. What changed was that the Dulles brothers reframed the risk. They moved the perceived threat from eventual communism to imminent communism. And Eisenhower believed it, or accepted it, or calculated that the political cost of appearing weak on communism was higher than the cost of removing a democratic leader. Take your pick. The point is, the argument had power because it was credible within the framework of the Cold War. But here's where the objection collapses. The documents show that the fear was manufactured. Eisenhower's own skepticism proves it. In March, he didn't think Mossadegh was a communist threat. 3 months later, he did. Did Mossadegh become communist? No. Mossadegh had already excluded communists from his government. The Majlis had already voted him emergency powers. Nothing changed except the narrative. The Dulles brothers told Eisenhower that the situation was deteriorating when the situation was stable. Mossadegh had 99.4% support in a rigged referendum because his government was popular. You don't get that kind of support if you're about to be overthrown. The math balances, but the logic doesn't. If Eisenhower really believed the communists were about to take over, why would the Shah have been so terrified of firing Mossadegh? Why would he have fled the country when he tried? Because the Shah knew the truth. Mossadegh had the population. The communists didn't. The threat Eisenhower approved an operation to prevent wasn't imminent communism. It was Mossadegh's popularity. It was his refusal to let the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, soon to be British Petroleum, keep its monopoly. The Cold War framework was the excuse, not the reason. The reason was oil. The same pattern repeats in Guatemala. Bernays wasn't a communist. His government had excluded communists. But Bernays needed him to be a communist so that American liberals would support a coup. The documents show Bernays writing. He considered the anti-communist movement subversive and openly accepted the Reds as allies. Considered them subversive. Accepted them as allies. That's not communism. That's coalition politics. Bernays was trying to build a broad movement for land reform. He needed allies. The Reds were allies. But Bernays took that pragmatic alliance and turned it into proof of ideological commitment. And it worked because liberals in 1950 had the same Cold War anxiety that Eisenhower had. Bernays didn't have to prove Bernays was communist. He just had to make it plausible enough that liberals would choose order over reform. The threat wasn't communism. It was land redistribution. United Fruit owned the land. Bernays wanted to take it back and give it to Guatemalans. That's the actual reason for the coup. But you can't sell a coup to American liberals by saying, we need to preserve corporate land monopolies. You sell it by invoking communism. The Cold War framework was the language. The economic interest was the motive. And here's the payoff. This same mechanism is still running. The Aless source on Russian disinformation describes how Russia targets socio-political fault lines, race, immigration, inequality. Russia didn't invent the tactic. America did. Bernays did. In 1950, he identified the fact that Guatemalans resented American land ownership, so he didn't argue that Guatemala should keep American land. He argued that Bernays would give the land to communists. He exploited the actual fault line, economic resentment, by reframing it as ideological threat. Now Russia does the same thing in America. They identify real resentment about immigration, about inequality, about race. Then they amplify it. They push people toward the most polarized version of that resentment. They don't have to create the divisions. They just have to make them visible and inescapable. The mechanism is identical. The only difference is that when America did it, we called it national security. When Russia does it, we call it an attack on democracy. The math balances, but the logic doesn't. If the mechanism is illegitimate when Russia uses it, it was illegitimate when America used it. If it was legitimate when America used it, then we have no grounds to object when Russia uses it now. You can't have it both ways. You have to pick. And if you pick that it was legitimate, that national security justifies information warfare, then you have to accept that Russia has the same right we claimed. Systems don't panic. They adjust. Here is the verdict. The United States government, from Eisenhower onward, has not been the victim of information warfare. It has been the architect and the precedent. Everything we claim to be shocked by, the astroturfing, the fake narratives, the exploitation of social divisions, the weaponization of media, these are American inventions. Bernays and Dulles didn't defend democracy in Guatemala. They overthrew it. Eisenhower didn't contain communism in Iran. He manufactured a threat to justify removing a leader who threatened American oil interests. The documents don't hide this. They memorialize it. Operation Ajax. Operation PBSuccess. The names were chosen so the operations could survive bureaucratic review. The language was chosen so future historians could find the evidence and still not have to call it what it was. And we didn't. For 60 years, we called it foreign policy. We called it national security. We called it necessary. The sources show us that every single euphemism was deliberate. Kermit Roosevelt knew he was paying street gangs. Allen Dulles knew he was targeting journalists. Edward Bernays knew he was manufacturing consent. They put it in writing because they believed, correctly, that institutional processes would protect them. And they were right. Nobody went to prison. Nobody lost their clearance. The operations succeeded. And they became the template for everything that came after. So when you read about Russian disinformation campaigns now, when you see the think tanks publishing papers about information warfare threats, when you watch the congressional hearings about election interference, you need to understand what you're actually looking at. You're looking at a nation that invented the playbook, complaining about teams that learned to read it. You're looking at an empire defending its monopoly on deception. That's not outrageous. That's consistent. Nations that succeed through covert action don't suddenly stop because the tactics become public. They adapt. They layer new justifications on top of old ones. They insist that their own operations were justified by context, the Cold War, the communists, the threat, while insisting that identical operations by rivals are inherent attacks on democracy itself. The math balances, but the logic doesn't. And the people making policy know this. They've read the files. They know what Eisenhower authorized. They know what Bernays wrote. They know that every tool being used against us was first tested by us. And they've decided that the game is worth playing anyway. Because the game works. It worked in 1953. It worked in 1954. It's working now. And it will work in the future until someone decides that the cost of maintaining the system is higher than the cost of dismantling it. That hasn't happened yet. But here's what the sources don't tell us. They don't tell us when the game becomes unplayable. Mossadegh was removed, and the Shah ruled for 26 years before the revolution. Arbenz was removed, and Guatemala spent 40 years in authoritarian hell, both followed by decades of anti-American sentiment that shaped entire regions. Foreign policy. The sources document the immediate success. They don't document the cost, because the cost comes later. The cost comes when the people who were lied to figure out they were lied to. The cost comes when that realization hardens into something that no amount of future disinformation can soften. The Islamic Republic of Iran exists because the 1953 coup existed. Venezuela's Chavista movement partly exists because of what happened in Guatemala. These aren't abstract historical consequences. They're geopolitical facts that change which nations align with which leaders rise, which ideologies spread. If you wanted to engineer anti-Americanism on a global scale, the 1953 Iran coup and the 1954 Guatemala coup were the masterclass. The people running these operations didn't understand that they were creating the conditions for their own future vulnerability. Or they understood it and calculated that short-term advantage was worth long-term resentment. Either way, we're living with the bill, and nobody is paying it. The question the sources raise but can't answer is this: what happens when everyone has learned the playbook? When disinformation is no longer an American privilege but a universal capacity? When the game is symmetrical instead of hierarchical? We're living in that world now, and we still don't have a strategy for it that doesn't